Dr. Wohlstetter, what was your background? You weren't a general or a soldier.
No, I sure wasn't. No, I had been a pure mathematical logician, concerned with that and with the logic of science. And during the war, I had, since my doctoral thesis had an application to quality control and manufactured products, the mathematics of it, I found myself in charge of a quality control department and then ultimately a factory producing electrical and electronic products like hand crank generators and that sort of thing.
What did you get your degree in?
It was in my work was in mathematical logic. That was essentially what it was. Yes.
Mark, turn your volume up, please.
So I had not of combat equipment, but no experience in otherwise.
Do you want Dr. Wohlstetter to speak up a little bit?
If you would, just...
All right, sure. All right.
Now, were you worried in the 50s about a nuclear Pearl Harbor, and why?
Well, I didn't start by being worried about anything like a nuclear Pearl Harbor, but I was concerned, I guess, beginning with August 1945, when I heard Truman's announcement of the A-bomb about the possibility of a nuclear war. And I undertook the study that I did partly as a way of understanding better what I regarded as what was obviously one of the great perils of our time, the possibility of a devastating nuclear conflict. I didn't begin by thinking about Pearl Harbor or anything of that sort, but just about nuclear weapons.
Well, is Pearl Harbor a...
I'm going to have to just make another adjustment.
Pearl Harbor is some relevant, yes. Yes.
But Pearl Harbor is sort of ingrained in the national psyche as the prime example of a surprise attack. Now, that was in the days of conventional weapons. Is when you get into the missile age, arming missiles with hydrogen bombs. Was there a concern in the 50s about a nuclear Pearl Harbor?
Oh yes, yes. What was characteristic of Pearl Harbor was that before it, we thought of having a fleet in Honolulu as a deterrent to Japanese attack, and specifically to Japanese attack on the Philippines and on Dutch Indonesia and so on. In fact, because the fleet was very vulnerable, it was not a deterrent but an invitation to attack. It was an obstacle which the Japanese felt they had to eliminate. And when you had a serious adversary with expansionary plans not to occupy the United States, but with an interest in expansion in the Eurasian periphery, the possibility that he might find us an obstacle, and an obstacle that could be eliminated by a surprise attack, therefore, was a serious one. And so that the Pearl Harbor, understood properly, had a continuing relevance, especially in an age when so much power could be concentrated in an initial blow. It was relevant because if you didn't take care, you could be very vulnerable.
Well, what was your concern about our vulnerability in the early 50s?
Yes. Well, I began not with the concern simply about vulnerability, but with trying to understand the problem of what sorts of strategic force we should have within the kind, and how you would operate the sorts of strategic force that was then possible to acquire. And this would face not problems simply of bomber attack, but problems of penetrating enemy defenses, and just the problem of getting there, because the sorts of bomber that was available were a very short radius. So I didn't begin by assuming with the problem of vulnerability as we understand it now.
Starting to smoke. Stop tape. Stop tape.
A little, not at where I started, but where I reached somewhat later. I found that,
You should look at.
yeah, yes.
I want you to put your best foot forward.
All right.
And
All right.
are you guys ready?
We're rolling.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. Were you concerned about that our forces in the 50s were vulnerable?
Well, we found they were. That was it. What we found is that our forces were vulnerable. If you looked at an attack that an adversary might make, which was designed specifically to destroy your strategic forces. The reason this hadn't been observed very much is that people were generally looking at an attack in which all sorts of targets were gone after. Detroit, steel, aluminum, any number of things that had no time urgency. And incidentally, a small proportion of the attack was devoted to attacking SAC. But the attack was so large that it had to be that it didn't gain surprise. And so we looked at attacks in which they didn't attack anything that didn't have to be attacked early, but was just designed to destroy SAC before it got off. And we found that it turned out very differently from the attacks that people had been considering up to that time.
What did you find if people attacked if the adversary's interest was strictly in attacking the Strategic Air Command, let's call it that?
Yes, in the Strategic Air Command. Well, what we found is that if they used a force which was consisted only in very bombers of quite primitive design, Dutch copies of our B-29s, and used a fraction of the number of bombs and rather low yield bombs, 40 KT bombs, a fraction of the number that was attributed to them by intelligence, that by following routes that just avoided our warning system, that they could catch SAC on base and destroy a very large proportion of it. And then SAC's plan was to go overseas, and that was like going from the frying pan into the fire, because it was supposed to set up for continuous operation overseas, which was a very elaborate and complex job of transporting. And there, on the overseas bases, they were much more vulnerable because they were closer and had no warning at all. So what we found then was that that even taking very optimistic assumptions from our standpoint, an attack that was designed to destroy SAC could do it, and could do it at successive stages. Our strategic forces, I should say.
Give me the summary of that again. It's not quite clear what we mean by successive stages.
Yes, they could destroy. The Soviets could, circuiting by avoiding our warning system, catch a lot of our strategic forces on the ground in the United States.
Oh, I'm sorry.
On the ground in the United States.
let's start again with the Soviets.
All
and
right,
they
yes, sir.
wanted to-
All right, well, perhaps I should just say that one thing as a preface to it. The plan of, we had very short radius bombers. They were based in the United States, and the plan, the so-called mobility plan, was to, at the outbreak of war, move them from their bases in the zone of the interior of the United States overseas to bases in England and a variety of places, North Africa and so on. And that they would then operate continuously from those overseas bases. What we found is that a Soviet attack that was designed specifically to attack only the urgent things, these things connected with our strategic force, could catch SAC on base before it could take off, because it was not, it was generally not ready to take off and for many hours, and it didn't have many hours of warning. And then, if the remainder that was not destroyed went overseas in accordance with the mobility plan, they could destroy it over there. So that at those two phases, then they would be subject to attack on the ground, and then of course it would have the problem of penetrating defenses with this much reduced ragged force.
So surprise attack was a concern.
It was indeed.
Can you speak of let's get to the high noon.
Right. Yeah. It was this is you want was this I can just make the statement, you just don't use it if you don't like. The result was surprising because the sorts of attack that had been considered at that time was an attack that dealt with a lot of traditional strategic targets, which were more or less a reflection of the kinds of targets that we attacked, not in a surprise. Attacks on cities, attacks on war-supporting industry that couldn't affect things for many months, and with very little of it, with only a small fraction of it devoted to SAC, but they had to be attacks so large that they went directly over the pole through the warning system and gave many, many hours of warning. And therefore, people hadn't in looking at the consequences of such an attack, discovered how vulnerable SAC was if instead an adversary designed his attack specifically to destroy SAC, rather than as an incident in a more generalized attack on industry and so on.
If SAC were vulnerable, then it's almost an incentive to a surprise attack.
Yes.
The guy that goes first it encourages going first. There's no advantage at all in delaying.
Yes, what it said was an invulnerable SAC can be a deterrent. A vulnerable SAC is an invitation. And in a crisis where alternatives look desperate to an adversary, it might be an urgent invitation.
It's sort of like a high noon.
Yes,
put that to the high noon metaphor.
Yes. If you ran into a situation in which you had both sides able to destroy the other, provided only that it struck first, it would be something like the situation of the classic gun duel at least in the Western movies.
An airplane.
It's just very loud.
So I'm going to ask you not to lean forward in the chair because it has a very...
I see. I see. All right.
Stand by 5 seconds.
Okay.
I would stress that in my view, and in the view of my colleagues, Fred Hoffman and Harry Rowan, we never thought of the problem as one that of a sort of bolt out of the blue in which the Soviets, for no reason other than they'd had nothing better to do that morning, would launch an attack. We thought of deterrence as something that would have to work when an adversary might see all his alternatives as bad. For example, if he were involved in a war on the periphery of Europe and he looked like being defeated, he might then regard it as safer to eliminate our most powerful opposing force than to leave it stay, just as the Japanese felt it was safer to eliminate the fleet in Honolulu while they expanded to the south than just to leave it there. So we thought of deterrence as a matter of risks, of making attacking us look riskier than the alternatives of not attacking us, even when those alternatives might look pretty bad, as they would in the case that I've cited.
How can we express the vulnerability to surprise attack in terms of the classic gun duel?
Well, it just depends on who got in the first shot. If in the classic gun duel, as it appeared at least in the Hollywood movies, either side could win, provided it got in the first shot, and that made a premium on getting in that shot. If on the other hand, you were behind a shield or in a well-protected fort, that was not an invitation to attack. And the problem was that we were in the 1950s extremely vulnerable simply because we hadn't devoted our attention yet to this problem.
So what was the answer?
The answer was to reduce the vulnerability of our strategic forces, to find another method of operating which would make us able to respond to warning without committing ourselves to war by getting off, as it turned out, in a way that we'd be willing to repeat. Go on alert, ground alert, strip alert if necessary, and actually take off and return unless it turned out that it was an actual attack, but actually to move on the basis of ambiguous warning, but move in a way that we could afford to repeat. You can't repeat, say, launching an ICBM. You can't launch that fail-safe. And it involved changing our method of operating overseas. Instead of operating overseas continuously, it meant using them essentially as refueling stations on the way, especially on the way back from targets, and just being on them very briefly. All right, we needed a force that we could operate with in peacetime responsibly. That means that it would not be liable to go off on false alarms. It couldn't be trigger happy. It would have to be able to, if it was going to use warning, which is always ambiguous, you'd have to be able to respond to false alarms without starting a war. So you needed a method of response then which would enable you to exploit such such warning repeatedly. And that was the method of, eventually, as it was formulated, of taking off on the basis of ambiguous but serious indications, not just something, a bird flying into the radar, but very serious indications. Take off, but with instructions to return unless there was a command from the National Command Authority to go forward, which would be done only if an attack had been confirmed. So what you needed to do is to be able to have a force that you'd be able to buy and operate with in time of peace, and which was not liable to destruction by a sudden surprise, something that you'd be able to use. You also needed a force that would be able to, you'd be willing to use, that meant that it would not be a force which was just go off on a mission of suicide, not just for the bombers, but for the nation.
Well, we needed a second strike capability.
We need
5 seconds, please.
a force cannot deter an attack which it cannot survive. And that was the key. What we found is that we had a force which we were thinking vaguely as a deterrent, but it couldn't survive the sorts of attack that we had designed, so it couldn't deter those attacks. And these were plausible attacks. They were not extreme. They were attacks which were estimated very optimistically from our standpoint, because we didn't want to raise foolish alarms.
Do you feel comfortable saying that a force cannot deter an attack that it cannot survive, and this meant that we had to rethink our force structure to make it?
Yes. That's, and what we found then when we looked at adversary attacks is that it meant we had to redesign our whole method of operating with the force.
Start again with a force cannot deter. Just repeat that.
A force cannot deter an attack which it cannot survive. When we found that the force, as it was designed to operate, could be destroyed by very plausible attacks, that meant that we had to find other ways of operating the force which would enable it to strike back after being attacked, being able to strike second.
In 1961, in the early days of the Kennedy administration, it seems that they acted on these principles and put the bombers on 15-minute alert, and or took that seriously and stressed the production of invulnerable Minutemen and Polaris and so on, and got rid of a lot of bombers and soft missiles and so on. Were you pleased with those decisions? What was your reaction to that?
Oh yes. The decisions made in the first 20 months or so of the Kennedy administration, in my view, were extremely important and very good decisions. The clear emphasis on getting forces which were less vulnerable, on getting a Minuteman force in silos, and getting submarine forces, and perhaps even more important and much less noticed, the great stress on trying to improve the ability of a responsible command and control to survive. This was looked at and several things were done about this: an airborne command post, a seaborne command that was mobile. This was looked at more seriously than it had ever been done before. Another thing that made it, that was that was at least equally important in my view, was that the Kennedy administration took a long step back from the almost total reliance on nuclear weapons to deter or respond to an invasion of Europe with. At the beginning of the Kennedy administration, there was a committee responding to the National Security Council, headed by Dean Acheson, that was looking at our policy for Europe. And I was Robert McNamara's representative on that committee, and therefore worked with Dean Acheson on it. And the essentials of it was to try to raise the threshold beyond which we would have to use nuclear weapons. And this was a move which did not win immediate approval from our allies. It took some 6 years later before the NATO approved the so-called flexible response policy, but it was a major importance, long overdue.
You know this way just a little bit less than the ag context.
And that was related to it because we were in the position related to the problem of nuclear deterrence, because remember, my own view of deterrence is that you shouldn't think of deterrence as something abstract, just related to bolts out of the blue, to unmotivated attacks. You should think of deterrence as something that would work when the alternatives that an adversary faced were very bad. And, for example, if he were losing, if he wanted to affect the outcome of a war in Europe, by improving the conventional forces, you reduced the likelihood that there would be an invasion in Europe or in some part of Europe, and that meant that the occasions on which you would be testing your deterrent, the shocks that the deterrent would have to sustain, would be reduced. So that it was important for that reason as well.
Did you have confidence that NATO could adequately deter the Warsaw Pact? I mean, after all, the conventional wisdom had always been that the Warsaw Pact was always so much superior.
Well, once again, I was always skeptical of the canonical sorts of attacks that we consider for NATO. Ones in which you have the Soviets attack all of NATO. That's regarded as a worst case, and in some sense it is, but it's the case in which it's easiest for NATO countries to make the decision to respond because they're attacked. The more dangerous case is where the Soviets, and with a much more plausible one, is where the Soviets make their attack at some weak point and give NATO countries the opportunity to opt out. Again, any sort of, I've never believed the Soviets are eager to get into any sort of war. However, the possibility of an attack, especially on a NATO flank, strikes me as being a serious one, and it struck me then as being an important contingency.
You weren't involved in the reevaluation of the Warsaw Pact capabilities, were you?
I only as one element of my work with the Acheson Committee. I drafted I did the draft of the Acheson report on the military, But Alan Enhoven and Harry Rowan had done some important work on reevaluating the Warsaw Pact forces. They did not assume, therefore, that there was no conventional threat. What they assumed was that the conventional threat was something that could be met conventionally, that you could raise the conventional threshold, and that was my own conclusion as well. The argument had been made that we had to rely on nuclear weapons because we were so badly outnumbered that we had no choice. And this is always one of the great dangers. People want a cheap, easy way out, and they try to sometimes will exaggerate a threat in order to exclude a possibility of responding to it, which would be expensive but sober and responsible, but use a cheap but rather irresponsible way of responding to it. And nuclear weapons always seemed like our way of answering the Soviet conventional superiority to many people. I've never thought that it was that we haven't had a monopoly on nuclear weapons since 1949, but we frequently have acted as if we did.
Well, the McNamara Pentagon rejected the whole notion of massive retaliation and tried to raise the nuclear threshold in one way by changing the war plan so that cities needed to be hit, didn't have to be hit, and that military targets could be hit, and that countries could be separated out one from another. And McNamara announced this at Ann Arbor in 1962.
Yes, well, actually, before the Ann Arbor speech, there were some changes just in the non-nuclear forces. Mm-hmm. Because we had for years been so fixed on a nuclear response to conventional attack, we didn't even have conventional bomb racks on our fighter bombers. It was just assumed in NATO, and a NATO decision, the NATO Military Committee, it was 14/2 is what it was called, that if there were any incursion into the NATO territory by the Warsaw Pact, even a local one, so long as it looked as if it was meant to stay, that this would mean the use of nuclear weapons and, in fact, World War III. This was essentially the one embodiment of the policy of massive retaliation. We didn't consider that we could respond to a non-nuclear attack up to some level with non-nuclear means, and one of the most important thing that the Atchison report did was to end the policy that was embodied in this decision of the Military Committee. It said that what we should do is build up our capability to respond to an attack in force without using nuclear weapons, and that we should use nuclear weapons only if they use nuclear weapons or if we were subject to an overwhelming defeat in conventional arms.
In 1961, when Kennedy took office, there was no capability there were no conventional bomb racks
on fighter bombers, that's right. That was because people there had been a policy decision to use nuclear weapons to make up for our inferiority in conventional force. So it wasn't contemplated that we would fight a conventional war for any serious length of time. Even if it was, as I say, a local incursion, provided that it was intended to stay, we would just use nuclear weapons. And what the Atchison report did was to change this. It just abolished that as a policy, and it said that we would prepare to respond to a conventional attack at its own level, and we'd use nuclear weapons only if we were going to be overwhelmed by conventional force. We had been unable to, but we would increase our capability to respond to a conventional attack.
I want to get another short statement of I mean, it's very surprising. The notion of the bomb racks weren't there. I mean,
I said, well, there were many, because we had a policy of responding even to quite small attacks, so long as they were persistent, they were calculated to persist with nuclear weapons. We were not even prepared to use our fighter bombers with conventional high explosives. They did not have bomb racks for conventional bombs. And that's just an example of the fact that we were not equipped and deployed to use conventional force, because that was not the policy.
Did this surprise you?
Well, I had learned about it, and I had believed since the mid-1960s that this was one of the things that we should change, that it was terribly important to end the policy of massive retaliation, because it would seem to me not to be credible, and policies which threaten things that would be of enormously high cost to us as well as to an adversary, which are disproportionate to the threat, to the attack that you're responding to, have always struck me as being very dangerous. They're things which are likely to be incredible. You might not actually respond, and an adversary might not believe that you would.
How did you feel about McNamara's speech at Ann Arbor, where he backed away from massive retaliation and said we'd try to
Well, that was another aspect of it. The most important backing away from massive retaliation that occurred in the Kennedy administration in 1961 was the Atchison report. What the McNamara Athens speech, which was essentially the same speech as he gave a little later in Ann Arbor, did was describe how nuclear weapons would be used. And what he said was that we would use nuclear weapons against military targets, rather just as one would use other, as the United States would use other weapons.
How did you feel about this in terms
I
of...
believe that I believed and believe today that that's the only prudent thing to do, and I think also it's the only moral thing to do. I don't believe that you should ever attack cities, and that there's no excuse for that. All right.
Massive retaliation wasn't credible. What about Ann Arbor? Let's pick up.
All right, let's say. All right.
Make up.
All right. The Ann Arbor speech announced a policy that I think made sense, because what essentially it was saying is that we would respond in a way that would be in our national interest. We'd respond against military targets rather than against population, and we would respond in a way that would at least give an adversary some stake in trying to confine damage as much as he could to military targets. Makes even more sense today, however, because the Ann Arbor speech came at a time when our nuclear weaponry was very ill adapted to a policy of discriminate use. And would you like me to expand a little on that? The point was bombs were 15 times as large in yield in 1957 as they became by the late 1970s.
I would, we can't get into today, because we're marching through.
All right, okay.
But I would like to get into, let's go through the evolution of McNamara's strategy and get your feelings about it. And when we get to the end, without
right.
talking about then we can talk about some of these.
All right, sure. Now, I haven't said what I think happened to McNamara when he changed his policy.
No, we're not on that yet.
Fine.
That's next. You are considered the father of these notions of deterrence and having a secure second strike retaliatory capability, and not relying on massive retaliation. McNamara announced this at Ann Arbor. Did you feel this helped our deterrence?
Well, I believe the policy that he was describing was something that would make our deterrent more believable. It was never because of the intervention of the Cuban Missile Crisis and subsequent things that Bob McNamara decided on and announced, which were incompatible with it. It was never fully implemented. But no one has been able to get away from that completely, and you had under Secretary Laird, and then Schlesinger, and Rumsfeld, and then under Harold Brown, a return to this sort of thing. And because the policy... Let them know. All right.
At the end of our talk, we can talk about the future.
All right, sure.
But,
all right.
I mean, do you believe, were you encouraged in 1962 by the announcement of a counterforce city avoidance strategy?
Yeah. Yes. I don't use the word counterforce. Let me just say, the statement that we were going to try to confine damage to military targets seemed to me to be right. And I was encouraged by that. It was something that I advocated. So I thought that was an important speech, and I believe that it should have led to some things which unfortunately were delayed by intervening events. But it was a good policy. The speech itself, I don't want to put too much weight on a speech. The question is what's done about the policy. I think that the speech announced a good policy. It was dealt with in a very half-hearted way, however, as policy.
Well, wasn't that partly because if the Air Force perceived it was our objective to concentrate on enemy military capabilities, then we would need more hardware to do so?
Well, that's the way the argument developed, and that was just very unfortunate. I think that Bob McNamara, the Air Force had the reaction, yes, that means we'll need more forces, but the Air Force would have that reaction to almost any change. That means we'll need more forces. And the answer to that was, we're not talking about just getting huge, indiscriminate attacks. What we're talking about, and we're not talking about attacking all military targets in an encyclopedic inventory of all possible targets. We're talking about responding in a way that's proportionate to the provocation, and this might be very small. It isn't the number that you need, it's the type of thing you need. I think that Bob McNamara made a mistake in the way he responded to it. He didn't have to say, in that case, you're not going to get any of it, and we're going to invent a new criterion, namely what's necessary in order to destroy 20 to 25% of the population, and that will be the way we determine our forces. That was unnecessary, and it was a debating point, and it was as bad a response as the Air Force going in position. In fact, worse.
Is there, McNamara was trying to find a criterion by which he could judge how much is enough in terms of the force level, how much hardware we need. Is it, will you grant him that if you were Secretary of Defense, wouldn't you want to ask the question, how much is enough? We can't keep buying hardware forever.
I would never phrase it in that way, because that's sort of like the question which your little boy or little girl asks, is how high is up? It's phrased in that way, it's just much too general. The question is, what sorts of forces would you need for the realistic contingencies that you'd face, and you'd have to take a look at those. To take as criterion, well, what we need is enough to destroy 20 to 25% of the population in the Soviet Union is a perfectly arbitrary thing, and in fact it makes no sense, because McNamara went on to indicate at that time that that isn't the way we'd use the force. That we'd use that as a criterion for what we'd buy, but in fact, if deterrence failed, we'd actually attack military forces. And
so you have no quarrel with him for.
I have a quarrel with him for using that as a using as a criterion for what you bought, the ability to destroy 20 to 25% of the population. One of the reasons for that is not just the fact that the implications of it for numbers. Much more important was that if you're talking about destroying population, they may be different sorts of forces. They could be inaccurate forces, large yield forces. And instead, what we want is a response which would try to confine damage to military targets. You just get different forces. So I didn't like the Air Force's statements as to what they need, and I sure didn't like McNamara's debate with them. They seemed to me to be off the point.
Do you think McNamara gave up on refining the forces, making them more discriminating, and gave up on sensible use options?
Well, let me put it this way. He paid much less serious attention to it.
We got to say McNamara. We can't have indefinite reference.
I think that McNamara paid much less serious attention to it after that formulation than he would have if he hadn't been tempted by this debate to adopt a very arbitrary and irrelevant criterion, one that suggested that we actually wanted to destroy Soviet population and wanted the capability to do just that. Made no sense.
But he would, I haven't talked to him yet, but he would say, and people who worked with him would say, that this was a procurement criterion. It had absolutely nothing to do with how these forces would be used. It was not accompanied by any new orders to Omaha.
Yes, that's true, but then the question is, then why do you have a criterion on what you'd buy which was irrelevant to how you'd use it? I think that the problem is that he was trying to limit numbers. Well, there are other ways of limiting numbers. That was just a bad way to do it. But in fact, what it meant was that it took attention away from the real changes that policy required, which was to push the state-of-the-art of discrimination, of confining damage. Now, some of that went on just as automatically as a result of the changes in technology that were going on for other purposes. You were getting, you were using air-to-surface missiles rather than gravity bombs, and they tended to be smaller, so you would have lower yields, and you were improving your accuracies also. But that could have been done, that technology could have been pushed much more rapidly if we understood that what we wanted to do was to confine damage more selectively to things that we wanted to eliminate and try to keep it from just innocent bystanders whose destruction only endangered our own innocent bystanders by making the whole thing get out of control. So I believe that was a bad move on McNamara's part, and it's the sort of thing that happens frequently in government. You get a polemic, you get a debate within the government, and people really forget what the point of it all is. They're scoring debating points, and that's what I think McNamara and the chiefs, and Sack in particular, got into.
The when McNamara left office, he foresaw the possibility that each side would have, Soviet Union and the U.S. would each have a secure retaliatory capability, and he had given up on on ABM, on major damage limitation possibilities. Now, how did you feel about this?
Well, I felt that then, and I said in many places, that against an attack, an ICBM attack, which was a major ICBM attack, which was designed to destroy as many civilians as possible, that we did not have the technology, the state-of-the-art did not permit us to get something that would keep damage very low. And you'll find many statements of mine saying they'd still be able to kill 40 million people and so on, given the state of the art. Now, I think that was not a very sensible sort of attack for the Soviets to make. I think it was a preposterous sort of attack. And we were spending too much time thinking about it. So I supported what was which was much more hopefully within the state of the art, the use of ballistic missile defense to defend military forces, and specifically the silos. Now, one of the reasons I did that was that Fred Hoffman and I had been the ones who had recommended the silos, and we expected them to be good into the 70s, but we expected that they would be good only against the early generations of ICBMs, which were very inaccurate, but that eventually the Soviets would get missiles that were accurate enough to seriously endanger the silos, And then, if you were going to keep silos, you'd have to do something else. Some people suggested, well, we just launch our missiles before the Soviet missiles arrived on warning. That struck us as being totally irresponsible. And what was an attractive alternative was to develop active defenses which would help you defend the silos. But that seemed to me to be more the problem rather than a Soviet attack on cities in our way of trying to get a defense against that which would be good against an all-out, unrestrained attack simply designed to destroy civilians. I didn't think that was a sensible attack for them, and I didn't think that we could get a defense against it.
Did you agree that with the notion that his action and reaction theme, that anything we do,
No.
that they're going to...
No, that, in fact, I spent a lot of time looking at, and that was simply wrong. When McNamara talks about an iron law of action and reaction, it suggests that if we undertake some development, inevitably the Soviets will take a counter-development which will cancel its value. I think this is simply wrong. There were many counter-examples of it. In fact, McNamara gave a good illustration of it. The Soviets were developing a ballistic missile defense of their population, it appeared. McNamara didn't say, therefore, we have to spend a huge amount of money or do exactly the same thing as they're doing. He said it's a very easy thing to penetrate. No arms race there. We could just use penetration aids, and it won't work won't work. That was an illustration of the fact that that you don't have to respond in a way that starts some sort of exponential arms race. But what I did do is I looked at the actual developments that we had taken, and I found that it wasn't true that we had been in an action-reaction spiral, which meant that each side was exponentially increasing its budgets. In fact, I found that the U.S. the strategic budget had, in real terms, been declining at the rate of 8% a year, while the Soviet budget had been going up just about as rapidly, and that they had tripled their strategic budget in real terms, while we were cutting ours to 1/3 of what it had been at the beginning of the 1960s. So the whole arms race notion seemed to me to be a very crude way of talking about a competition between the two sides, and that it led to just false statements about just what had happened. If you have an adversary who is seriously opposed to you and who might, under some circumstances, attack you or one of your allies, then obviously you're in a competition and you have to do something to counter. You have to be prepared for it and to have weapons which will defeat him and defeat this attempt. But that doesn't mean that you're going to have exponentially increasing budgets, and our experience has been that nothing of the kind has occurred. So I thought that the action-reaction theory of the arms race was again a debating point, and it did no reference to reality.
Well, let me pose a question. You have always been interested in a credible deterrent. Now, when McNamara backed away from the counterforce, whatever, and started talking in terms of assured destruction, he was saying we have and will always have a second strike capability. that can inflict unacceptable damage on the Soviet Union. Didn't this satisfy you, the father of the whole notion of second strike capabilities?
No. When McNamara said that we'll have a second strike capability to destroy a quarter to one-fifth of the rural and urban population of the Soviet Union, I was pleased that he wanted to have a second strike capability. I thought it was wrong, however, to suggest that the adequacy of that capability should be measured in terms of the number of people killed, of innocent bystanders killed. There was nothing in the second strike notion which suggested that we had to destroy innocent bystanders rather than military forces. The Soviets value military forces enormously. Power grows out of the barrel of a gun, is the famous statement of Mao, to which Lenin would have subscribed. It's enough to indicate that you destroy their military power. It's not necessary to say that you'll destroy the population. Moreover, it's important that you don't suggest that that's what you're going to do for several reasons. One, you're suggesting you're going to do something which he may believe you'd never do because it would expose your own population to the same thing. If you define unacceptable damage and you try to make that in terms of population, then you shouldn't have to say, I'm going to administer unacceptable damage, therefore you're not going to accept it, therefore you're not going to act. And you're not going to act because you know that I would accept unacceptable damage in response. That's the mistake. It's saying that you're going to act in a way that would not be in your interest at the time. Maybe he'd believe it, but it's risky because we're not talking about deterring some sort of idle thought of attack. We're talking about deterring a man who is facing bad alternatives, who maybe have started a conventional war where he's very much at risk and where he's looking for a way out. It's at that point you want him to believe that you'd respond in a way that would be in your own interest, and that would be bad for him.
Could you have as a procurement criterion? Well, if your goal was to inflict unacceptable damage on the Soviet military forces, could you do that without having an endless procurement of hardware?
Oh yes, remember. In fact, I think it's kind of, it shows how far you can get from reality sometimes when you talk about nuclear weapons. It was, no one has ever said that we should attack villages, that an army, for example, in our armies in World War II should only attack villages because if we attacked tanks, the Germans would, or whatever enemy we had at the time, could always buy more tanks. And then we'd have to buy still more things to attack the tanks with. The notion that if you attacked military forces, this got you into an exponential arms race, makes no sense, because that's in general what military forces have been about. They haven't been about attacking villages or whatnot. They've been about attacking other military forces, and yet we haven't gotten into exponential arms races.
What?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Do you feel at the end of the McNamara years that he had adequately addressed the question of what do we do if deterrence fails?
No, I think that he evaded it more.
No, he's.
No, I think that towards the end of the McNamara years, McNamara didn't look at the most plausible cases where deterrence might fail and ask himself, what would we do in that case? The most plausible cases that deterrence would fail would be where we were engaged with the Soviets on the periphery of the Soviet Union, the Eurasian periphery, and where they might have undertaken an invasion which failed. In that circumstance, they might use nuclear weapons. And they might use it against an ally. They might use it against an ally like Norway or against Turkey. Now, you have to ask yourself, what would we do in that case? I'm deliberately talking about a nuclear attack on these countries because, like Bob McNamara, and even for a longer period, I've been in favor of improving our conventional forces. But what would you do if the Soviets used nuclear weapons against an ally to whom we've given a nuclear guarantee? Would you respond indiscriminately? Would you against Soviet cities? Would you respond in a way that you thought would unleash an uncontrollable destruction? I don't think you would. So that if you don't think seriously of such contingencies, then it seems to me you don't face the problem of deterrence where it's most poignant. How do you deter attacks that are the most plausible sorts of attacks that nuclear attacks that the Soviets might make, the most plausible things that would occur on the most plausible occasions for his using nuclear weapons, and how do you do that in a way that would be in your national interest? How do you make threats to respond that are believable if you're saying you're going to respond by unleashing uncontrollable destruction that would engulf you as well?
Yeah, now Mac Bundy and Glenn Kent and McNamara and Mort Halperin and Alan Endelman would say that may have been a threat, but we wouldn't have behaved that way.
Well, what I'm saying is, all right, then let me go back. When you threaten to do something and then say, of course, I'm only kidding, that isn't what I'm going to do, then it's a curious kind of threat. It's a threat which you say, I'm not serious about. In that case, why don't we make a threat that we're serious about, one that we'd be willing to implement? It all goes back to the desire, to the polemic between McNamara and the Air Force here, and it was an unnecessary polemic. There are other ways of constraining forces than by pretending you're going to do something you'd never do.
Let me ask you another question about the 50s. I'm going back to the Gaither Committee, the Gaither Report. What was what advice did you give them?
Well, Rowan Gaither, who was chairman of the Gaither panel, was also chairman of the RAND Board of Trustees. And the Gaither panel, in its origins, was to look at a very large-scale civil defense program. He called me, I'm sure I'm not the only one he called, to ask what I thought the terms of reference had best be, what would be most fruitful for them to look at. And I said that I thought it was important to broaden the terms of reference to look at the problem of how you get a deterrent force which would be viable given the sorts of changes in the state of the art that were then in process in the Soviet Union and ourselves, and given the fact that we, as he knew, having heard earlier studies, reports of two earlier major studies that I had been involved in with Harry Rowan and Fred Hoffman, and in one case Bob Lutz, that in fact we had very serious problems in the survivability of our forces, and that therefore this would be something which a group of such at so high a level could focus attention on.
What did you recommend?
I recommended then, so he asked me then, and I was asked to come give a briefing, and what I recommended then was essentially the list of things that we had come up with as the result of our second major study on protecting our power to strike back in the 50s and the 60s. And that meant a list of measures like the silo, fail-safe methods of response, improvements in command and control, a list of some 50 measures, all of which would give us a more credible capability to respond to the sorts of Soviet attack which could come for example, in the era of missiles.
Did you recommend change in overseas basing?
We had the major changes in overseas basing had already been implemented. What had not been done was as the result of the first study that we had completed in '53 and briefed for almost a year. There were some parts of that study, those affecting the method of operation in the continental United States, which had not been fully implemented, and moreover, we found that the command and control in particular had many further vulnerabilities, and so our recommendations for the way of operating in the continental United States, especially, needed change, and changes in procurement as well. So, and we did recommend that, and the Gaither Committee adopted those measures among many others, because it also went on with a big civil defense program and a big ABM program, which was not part of our recommendation.
Did you find in the 50s that when you briefed SAC on your vulnerability concerns, were they receptive or were they hostile? Are there any stories of them not wanting to listen to this?
On the whole, I think both SAC and the Air Force as a whole behaved very well in response to it. I did not expect that we would go to Omaha and go to Washington and the various commands and immediately be greeted with, but of course, why hadn't we thought of this? Let's go right ahead. We were suggesting 180-degree changes in some respects, and they had every reason to want to see how we had arrived at these conclusions, some of which were not intuitive. And so they subjected it to very detailed scrutiny. The very first reactions were very favorable. People were impressed that it was a very serious study on a subject of greatest importance. But it didn't get immediate assent, and it shouldn't have gotten immediate assent. It was briefed ultimately, I guess, over 90 times, and It was debated in the Air Force Council for several weeks in my presence, so that it didn't and shouldn't have gotten immediate assent, but it was given a very serious and detailed and responsible scrutiny by the people whose lives and responsibilities it affected.
I want to go back and do our gunfighter thing one more time, because you're warmed up. And
All right.
How can I don't know how can I phrase it? For the transcriber's purposes, this is for program 5 and not 4. The
You didn't. All right. You want?
the metaphor of the gunfighter as one of vulnerability that invites a first strike,
Yes.
and how this demands restructuring our forces so that we have a second strike capability. That's what I want to get at.
Yeah.
Imagine. Start off with imagine, and this is where we were in the 50s.
Yes.
Imagine 2 gunfighters.
All right. Imagine the old Western gun duel, which you have two gunfighters, either one of whom can destroy the other, provided he gets in the first shot. That's an extremely unstable situation if they come into the same saloon, and that was the sort of situation that that was of concern to me when and to all of us when we found that in fact SAC packed the most powerful punch in history, but that it was one that could not be delivered if they didn't get it in first. There was no indication that anyone really had been thinking about striking first. On the contrary, everything we saw suggested that nobody was thinking of that. But unfortunately, we had developed a capability which could only be used first.
You hesitated too much. I mean, I think this is. I want to.
I see.
This is our star statement.
All right.
The,
All
the,
right.
I mean, the key words, the key phrases are a second strike capability and
Yes,
and the
Yes.
so
Yes.
I think you have to.
Yes, you wanted. Yes.
So
all right.
this led us to, or what we had to do was to develop the invulnerable second strike capability.
Yes, we had. Yes.
Imagine the two.
Yes, if we had the capability to do enormous harm to an adversary, provided we struck first. Unfortunately, we found that we could do that only if we struck first, so that it would be just possibly like the old-fashioned gun duel, where who emerged at all depended on who got in the first shot. It seemed essential for us, therefore, that we get a capability that didn't depend on getting in on the first shot, that was a capability to strike second, not just first. There was no intention that we ever saw that a serious attention in the leadership of the United States to get in the first strike, but there just hadn't been adequate consideration of how you design an attack, a response which could survive an attack that was designed to prevent us from responding.
As a result of the Soviet buildup in the 60s, a condition arose probably in the early 70s, but it could be foreseen in the 60s McNamara Force Art, when each side would have an assured destruction capability, and this gave rise to the acronym MAD, which was, many people say, is simply a condition of mutual destructive capabilities.
Yes.
Now, do you agree with that assessment that MAD is a condition?
Well, it's frequently said that MAD is a condition rather than a policy. These terms are somewhat vague, but I believe that that's something of a cop-out. When you talk about mutual assured destruction, it sounds as if no matter what we do, the laws of physics mean that both sides will be totally destroyed. That will be a certainty in the event that nuclear weapons are used. I don't think that that's the case. It's quite true that destruction is possible, but to say that that can't be affected by the will of either side as to whether it will actually occur in a war seems to me to be a grave error. And this is illustrated by, in many ways, both in the kinds of policies that have been advocated by people who talk of using threats of mutual assured destruction, both unilateral defense policies and policies on agreements. Ambassador Smith, who was the chief negotiator of the ABM Treaty, has just said, for example, that the genius of the ABM Treaty was that it meant that each side agreed to be defenseless. Now, if MAD were a matter of physics, if it were a condition rather than a policy, what would it mean to be saying that we agree to implement these laws of physics? We don't agree to, we don't have any agreement to abide by the law of the second law of thermodynamics. We don't agree to follow the principle of gravitation. In fact, MAD is a policy. It's a policy which discourages our ability to contain any disaster. It discourages our ability to discriminate, to confine damage to military targets, or to defend population. And in that sense, it seems to me to be very wrong. It seems to me to be unconvincing as a deterrent, because it says that we'll be threatening to commit suicide, and it also seems to me to be just wrong, period, because it suggests that we would bring about the destruction of innocent civilians deliberately. I therefore think that MAD is a policy. Threats of mutual assured destruction as a policy which is a bad policy, and it leads to many wrong policy recommendations. There are sorts of agreements that we could make which are much more consistent with the tradition of arms control and disarmament in the past, in which we actually discourage attacks on civilians. There are unilateral policies that we could make that would increase our power to keep things under control. These are the sorts of things that I think we should be doing, and people who advocate the use of MAD threats seem to me to be discouraging them.
What do you think, Wes?
I like that. There's also the question of, and what implications did it have in terms of the strategic posture of the United States subsequently, and leading into the decisions of the Kennedy administration in 1960.
Some were made during the Eisenhower administration by the Air Force itself, actually.
Yeah, it's also.
The notion of deterrence, of course, is an ancient one. You'll find it in Thucydides. And you did have discussions of deterrence in the nuclear age, and, for example, you'll find it mentioned in the Finletter report on policy in the air age. However, these were very general sorts of statements, and they were not linked to the notion of a capability for a second strike with your nuclear force. Strategic forces had generally had as their traditional targets war-supporting industry in an era when that was theoretically separable from population, and definitely separable from the strategic forces themselves. That was what they were thought of as doing. In the course of World War II, the distinction between war-supporting industry and population tended to be blurred, as we saw at Dresden and many other places. And the kind of thing that people were thinking of was about strategic forces was illustrated in some of the early writings on it. Country A, that famous country, would strike the cities of Country B at 9 o'clock, and 3 hours later, Country B would strike the cities of Country A. Well, that's not related to getting a nuclear force that could survive attack. What was new was the recognition that an attack that was designed specifically to surprise and destroy your nuclear force could be effective, could deprive you of the capability of striking second, and therefore, if you had a force that was subject to obliteration in that way, in a surprise attack, you would be inviting rather than deterring attack. And it was the look, which was a detailed empirical look at how that might happen under very optimistic assumptions, even from our standpoint, with the force that was then that we then had, and with the forces that we were likely to have for a long time to come. That was the new departure. That was the difference.